Okay, colleagues, hello and welcome back. Now, today I wanted to share some thoughts on the topic of fear. Fear, so to speak, within the structure of modern politics. The role of fear in the construction of the modern state, if you want. Now, what prompted me to do this video was actually a discussion we were having with students in a class on ancient Chinese political philosophy. So we were basically discussing the contrasting views of Confucius and the legalist school. Now, I guess without going into any real detail, the view of Confucius can be summarized in the following way: that the basis of a successful state, successful and harmonious, a well-governed state, this basis should be love, if you want. And the contrasting legalist view is that, no, human beings are by nature bad, therefore love will not work. So what you need instead is fear. So we have this interesting dichotomy. What should be the basis of a successful, well-organized society? Should it be, mutual respect, love if you want, or should it be fear and the threat of violent punishment? No, I think a very interesting question. All sorts of parallels immediately come to mind. And this is basically what I wanted to do, to explore some of these parallels. And conclusions up front. I think at the end of the day, it seems to me that for better or for worse, the basis of our contemporary politics is fear. Okay, let me step back and let me give you some of the considerations that come to mind with respect to this picture. So again, let's go back to the ancient Chinese. There's actually a wonderful book by Karen Lai, The Introduction to Chinese Philosophy, published by Cambridge University Press. I think a wonderful book, and definitely an excellent topic for a future video. To go into some of the details of the ancient Confucian, legalist, and Taoist philosophies. Some of the nuances I think are very instructive and really quite fascinating. But again, let's leave the detailed discussion to another day. Let's again paint using broad brushstrokes. So again, it seems that for Confucius, although one has to remember that Confucius doesn't really write treatises, the Analects is more of a collection of sayings or aphorisms. But to the extent that one could try and extract a political philosophy from Confucius's Analects, it seems that for Confucius, the basis for a properly ordered, harmonious society has to lie in a certain internal, deep moral attitude. The Chinese term for this is zhen, I think. So in English, it's written as R-E-N, Ren. To the best of my Chinese knowledge, pronounced as zhen. So this word, zhen, could be translated into English as benevolence, probably the most appropriate word, but also benevolence, humaneness, love, or even virtue, I think. And again, it refers to this deep internal psychological disposition of kindness, respect, agreeableness, maybe, for the lack of a better word. And this is a feeling that is very much associated with the familial life. So this is the kind of feeling that animates the natural cooperation between the members of a family. I'm reminded of Thomas Hobbes, who talks about how even in the state of nature, in this condition of war of all against all, humans nevertheless feel a natural affinity towards close kin. I think Hobbes refers to this feeling of natural lust, using the word lust in the broad sense of the word, to include, for example, the affinity of parents for children and of children for parents, so not necessarily in a sexual manner. So again, this zhen, humanness or benevolence, associated with the family, then for Confucius is supposed to be the basis of a successfully run state. So for Confucius, one is supposed to see the emperor as a father figure, the ministers as older brothers or older uncles maybe, and then the subjects are seen as women and children. And again, there's this general idea that runs through political philosophy, that as long as human actions are animated by the proper kind of internal moral feeling, everything's going to be fine. However, on the contrary, if this kind of feeling is lacking, no amount of quote-unquote good law or severe punishments would do, because if the moral basis of society is lacking, laws will always be circumvented. Now, an interesting aside, because the feeling of zhen, or benevolence, is supposed to be cultivated in the immediate family, for Confucius, the immediate family seems to take precedence over the interests of the state. So let's say if there's a conflict between one's familial obligations and one's civic obligations, one is supposed to choose in favor of the family. So, among other things, it would be inappropriate for Confucius to testify, let's say in a court of law, against one's close kin. And again, I suppose the logic is clear enough. The basis of society is supposed to be cultivated in the immediate family. That's why, if the state were to try to undermine one's loyalty to one's family, then the broader basis of society in general would be undermined as well. Incidentally, I think that most countries in the world have similar kind of legislation, in the sense that, again, even in 2020, in most countries that I know of, one is never obliged to testify against close kin. So this is the Confucius side of the story. But what the legalists bring to the table is the completely opposite view. So it seems that whereas Confucius presupposes that human beings are by nature good, and therefore that politics of consensus, politics of harmony are quite possible, the legalists, one way or another, presuppose that human nature is evil. And therefore to rely on this kind of internal feeling is contrary to sound government. It's also kind of interesting how Han Fei, one of the founding, or at least one of the most important legalist writers, talks about how in the past, quite possibly human beings were good-natured, kind-natured, naturally cooperative. However, as the population increased and resources grew scarce, so the human nature has become corrupt, and government policy can no longer rely on the natural instinct for cooperation. So instead, Han Fei and the legalist school in general propose to base government policy on the strict penal code, and more importantly on the feeling of fear that this penal code is supposed to engender. And as to the details of the functioning of this penal code, the legalists also had a whole host of very modern-sounding ideas of, let's say, employing objective and publicly available standards of conduct, so that individual performance is assessed, again, in an objective fashion, against a pre-existing standard. Let's say how a governor of a province could be, let's say, assessed by the amount of rice that the province produces, with the mechanisms of surveillance and other various forms of assessment in place. Again, it's hard not to be reminded of Michel's Foucault, Discipline and Punish, when talking about the legalists. Also, within the legalist framework, we can see this, bare bones of the idea of checks and balances, where I think there's, an understanding or an assumption of a fundamental conflict of interests of all the members of society between each other. Sort of the people versus the bureaucracy versus the ruler, and again, at the end of the day, in a deep sense, I think everybody against everybody. And how the ruler is supposed to use secrecy to observe the behavior of the subjects, and especially of the bureaucracy being likely to undermine the designs of the ruler. And then also how the ruler is supposed to play off the members of the bureaucracy, high-ranking officials if you want, against one another. We could go into many more detail, but I want to step back and to try to make a more general comment on what seems to me to be a fundamental transition in the way that human political life is organized. And this transition is, broadly speaking, from a more basic hunter-gathering style of existence. Again, human genome has evolved, by and large, while humans were hunter-gatherers. But then, very importantly, human civilization only takes off with the beginning and on the basis of the agricultural revolution. So a couple of examples from the literature come to mind in this respect. So one is from a book by Francis Fukuyama, The Origins of Political Order, where Fukuyama tries to explicitly compare the politics of early human communities to the social or political arrangements, if that's an applicable word, of our closest primate relatives, evolutionarily speaking. Today, this would be the chimpanzees, first and foremost. And Fukuyama emphasizes how, in the kinds of alliances and structures of hierarchy, of social hierarchy, that exist in chimpanzee tribes, but also the kinds of differentials of power that we can observe in existing human hunter-gathering communities. So even in 2020, but also relying on the vast anthropological literature. So what Fukuyama points to is this absence of large power differentials, this lack of appropriate authority, even on the part of the chiefs or on the part of alpha males in a chimpanzee pack, to simply order the members of the tribe around. So instead of direct obligatory commands, what we have are, broadly speaking, injunctions to act in a certain fashion. So it's like the chief can strongly suggest or try to strongly encourage another member to act in a particular fashion, but not really to order, in a sense that maybe we could associate with Max Weber's account of authority. But then, as humanity transitions from this more, genetically speaking, natural way of living in a hunter-gathering setting to an agricultural mode of life, now we do get huge differentials of economic wealth, and it seems, therefore, by extension, differentials of political power. In a broadly speaking Marxist fashion, I think that it's appropriate to link the two. It is because somebody like the pharaoh controls vast resources that the pharaoh can afford to keep a retinue of armed men, so the threat of physical violence, but also the retinue of holy men, if you want the symbolic violence perpetrated by the official religious ideology. And these two violent faces of the same power coin, the physical and the symbolic violence, then sustain this huge power differential between the pharaoh and his subjects. I think I'm kind of digressing, but let me just finish this thought. So in a related passage, Robert Wyman, a demographer from Yale, again offers something akin to a Marxist explanation, in the sense that the hunter-gatherers do not really have an economic surplus. The hunter-gathering mode of subsistence does not allow for the generation of economic surplus that could, in principle, be expropriated. So, to use a different phrase, hunter-gatherers do not have slavery, because technologically speaking, slavery is not viable in a hunter-gathering society. If one person has to feed two, in the long run, one of them will die of starvation. I am not sure if this is actually true, because incidentally, sometimes people talk about hunter-gathering technology of production, for lack of a better word. Sometimes people talk about how actually hunter-gatherers get a higher amount of food per hour spent working. But then hunter-gatherers do get much less per square kilometer of land. And so when land becomes the limiting factor, basically the agricultural societies will always win. And again, reminded of Rousseau a little bit. So maybe the reason why hunter-gatherers do not have slaves is because it's very hard to make sure that your slaves don't run away if you are a hunter-gatherer. Basically, the master falls asleep and the slave just takes off and leaves. Whereas for agriculturals, again, the agriculturals have to stay in one place. Again, reminded of a course of ancient Chinese history that I listened to not so long ago. This idea that nomads are uncivilized because you cannot tax them. You come and try to impose a tax and they just run away. Whereas the agriculturals, people who grow rice, you send the army to stand on their fields and you demand they pay the tax. Otherwise, you burn their fields. Or something along those lines. The agricultural people cannot run away in this sense. And because they are in this fashion tied to the land, it's much easier to control them. So I'm sure I'm not explaining this very clearly, but at the same time I hope you can see the parallels. This idea how in earlier hunter-gathering times there was abundance, and also society seems to have been run on a broadly speaking familial basis, I think very much akin to what Confucius calls zhen, this humaneness or benevolence. And then in later times, quite possibly because the population grows and land becomes the limiting factor, and therefore humans are forced to begin engaging in agriculture. A plausible story. By the way, we can see exactly this story in Rousseau's second discourse, the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. Rousseau talks about how agriculture is really, really hard work. You would never engage in it out of your own free will. It has to be the external circumstances, Marxists would say, objective material conditions, that force individuals to engage in blood, sweat, and toil of agricultural lifestyle. Anyway, so we begin, it seems, in this Confucian fashion, with humane and benevolent hunter-gatherers, at least internally, because whereas there seems to be a fairly harmonious arrangement within the tribe, between the tribes, as far as paleontologists tell us, there's a constant genocidal war. So, this out-group versus in-group. In-group cooperation and benevolence, out-group competition, violence, and maybe even genocide. And then, again, let's think back to Han Fei. As the population increases and the land becomes scarce, human beings are forced to engage in agriculture, and human nature becomes corrupt, says Han Fei in an almost Rousseauian fashion. And so it becomes impossible to govern through benevolence, and now one has to govern through fear. Again, another obvious parallel would be with Thomas Hobbes. This idea that in the state of nature, it is possible to have small families, says Hobbes, but once we imagine a more modern kind of condition, and Hobbes incidentally never seems to really talk in detail about the ancient prehistoric past. When Hobbes talks about the state of nature, it is a way for him to talk about human nature today in our present conditions. And today, Hobbes says, we live in this constant shadow of the danger of the social world collapsing into this war of all against all. And the only way to keep society moving forward is for the government, for the sovereign, to keep all men in awe through fear of violence, basically. Power to punish. And so I think if one takes a step back from this whole discussion, and if one asks oneself, look outside the window, what kind of a world are we living in? Many people, including many students, are tempted to talk in a Confucian fashion, that no, actually we live in a harmonious society, and the government takes care of us, in this Aristotelian or Hegelian fashion, that man by nature is a political animal, and therefore society first and foremost enables us. But at the same time, I think if we look deeper beneath the surface, it's quite clear that to a very large extent, this picture of harmony and consensus is very much an ideological dream. Yes, the books, the movies, the cartoons for children, the Hollywood films paint this picture of, idyllic harmony and consensus of how the good guys win, and this world is very much a cosmos and not a chaos. And we obey because we freely choose to obey. Again, this Enlightenment dream that I am rational and the laws of my society are rational, and therefore I freely and rationally choose to obey the laws of my society. But, and this is the crucial point, if with Marx, with Han Fei, with Hobbes, and with Foucault, we look closely and try to examine closely our everyday experience, I think it becomes very clear that our culture is a culture of fear. It's hard for me to imagine that prehistoric hunter-gatherers grew up with the kinds of anxieties that our modern society imposes on us, basically since the time that we are born. I imagine that for most people, at least most people I know personally, The childhood experience, one way or another, revolves around fear. Probably most often associated with school. School is a disciplinary institution. We go there afraid of doing something wrong, afraid of doing something maybe shameful or even criminal, who knows, afraid of being scolded by the teacher, afraid of being, punished with detention, let's say, or afraid of getting a bad grade, afraid of failing the course, afraid of, flunking out of school or being expelled, who knows. And also, if I think back to my parents or my grandparents, and I would imagine this is a much more universal experience throughout the world, the 7 billion people alive on planet Earth today, in addition to this stress of school, or maybe often instead of it, there's the stress of work. Because of course, throughout the world, not the first world, but throughout the world in general, the vast majority of children are engaged in economic, productive activity since early childhood. And this activity is, I would imagine, most of the time, motivated not by the prospect of reward, but by the fear of punishment. And of course, I'm talking about childhood, but once a person grows up, anxieties and fears do remain. Fear of being fired, of being penalized, of being demoted, fear of the police, of the government, the ubiquitous surveillance, etc., etc. I do think that if we think about this carefully, it's quite obvious that we live in the world of legalism, not in the world of Confucianism. Confucianism works very well as an ideology, but under the facade of this ideology, under the facade of this idyllic and harmonious state masquerading as a family, under this facade, we see legalist institutions, the threat of punishment, and the corresponding fear. Again, if we think back to Foucault, and if we think back to Durkheim, it seems that punishment isn't just some particular thing that societies do. No, punishment, in a certain sense, seems to be the most important thing that society does to shape the individuals. And I think it's an interesting question, why punishments and not rewards? And thinking back to Thomas Hobbes and to John Stuart Mill, I think there's this deep asymmetry in human psychology between the fear of punishment, which is visceral and highly effective, and the prospect of the reward, which is kind of ephemeral and ineffectual. People are hard to please. I like one thing today, maybe I like a different thing tomorrow. A given pleasure I can usually do without. In a certain sense, pleasure and desire are subjective. But fear, and especially death, are objective. And especially if we think of the highest fear, the fear of death, or maybe of fear of slow, violent, and painful death, it's kind of hard to imagine what kind of a pleasure could potentially offset that in the minds of individuals. Again, as far as my psychologist friends tell me, human psyche in general is structured much more in response to fear and anxiety. Sort of even within our own heads, within the electrochemistry of the brain, we behaviorally respond to dopamine spikes. Dopamine, which seems to be associated with craving. Craving is something unpleasant. So, in a deep sense, there's this negative motivation. Motivation to get rid of a painful sensation. And I think in general it's an important point to keep in mind. Craving is a bad predictor of what makes us happy or even of what gives us pleasure. Again, as far as I gather, if we take an extreme example of, let's say, heroin addicts, an addict experiencing withdrawal is in deep pain and torment, craves the drug immensely. And the drug itself relieves the torment, but does not really bring any positive pleasure. I'm talking about an addict with a history of addiction. Obviously, the very first several times, heroin is highly pleasurable. But then the pleasure goes away, and all the person is left with is craving. And kind of a mundane and pedestrian example, but still let me give it. There are certain things that, for example, I enjoy tremendously, like yoga, for example, or playing the piano, or going for a walk. But I never crave yoga, and I never crave playing the piano, or crave going for a walk. So in this sense, the psyche is kind of wired in the mistaken way that it fails to make me crave the things that really make me happy. Whereas the things that will make me incredibly unhappy in the long run and sometimes in the short run, I leave it to your imagination what kinds of things I have in mind. These things I do crave. Again, to not talk about me, but to talk about people in general. We all know how an alcoholic craves a drink, but the drink does not make him or her happy or healthy in the long run. Same with addiction to drugs, and similar things can be observed with food or video games or sex. Fill in your favorite craving. So this whole psychological discussion is really kind of an off-topic, and obviously is a much more pedestrian consideration. But I think in its own way, it helps me draw this larger point that human behavior seems to be mostly driven by negative psychological motivation, both in terms of personal life and in terms of human political arrangements. I'm reminded of how, when I talk about Martin Heidegger, I'm always tempted to refer to Howard Phillips Lovecraft. So I think there's a way of reading both philosophers to the effect that all of human civilization, all of these wonderful cities and roads and artifacts in general that we make, can be seen as an attempt to sublimate, to bracket, this fundamental fear and anxiety in the face of the potentially unfriendly universe that we inhabit. And that's, I think, one maybe more spiritual direction into which one could take this general discussion. Another direction, very obviously, is the direction of critical social theory, going back, at least in the Western tradition, to the ancient sophists, to people like Thrasymachus, a character in Plato's Republic, who talks about how in any given community, justice is nothing else but the interest of the stronger party, which again, through symbolic ideological violence, ideological indoctrination, and the threat of physical punishment, keep the population at large in check. Again, justice being nothing but the interest of the stronger. Again, reminded of Heraclitus, with his dictum, Polemos pater panton, war is the father and the king of all. So these are the kinds of thoughts that come to my mind in response to what actually is a fairly basic introductory seminar to ancient Chinese political philosophy. Big questions. Is this world a chaos or a cosmos? Are we actually ultimately at home in the world? Or is the feeling of alienation that so many people experience a genuine sign pointing to the fundamental discrepancy, the fundamental mismatch between our subjective aspirations to be happy, to feel at home, and the objective reality of the abyss of the purposeless chaos of matter? Who knows? Who knows? Let's not jump to conclusions, but let's instead keep thinking about this topic together. So I hope you found this stimulating, even if somewhat haphazard, presentation. I hope I've given, if not answers, then at least interesting questions to contemplate. And so, until next time, take care.